The valiant aviators of the United States 8th Air Force swiftly came to realize that the menace of anti-aircraft artillery, commonly known as Flak, instilled a far greater dread than engagements with enemy fighter aircraft. By the summer months of 1943, the formidable German interceptors, though still a significant threat, could often be repelled or outmaneuvered through the implementation of tightly coordinated bomber formations and the crucial presence of escort fighters. However, the ominous, dark convolutions of exploding 88 mm shells relentlessly pursued the bomber streams, clinging to them like an inescapable shadow throughout the arduous journey to their designated targets. The cold, unfeeling statistical data presented a harrowing narrative, unequivocally demonstrating that nearly 70% of all B-17 Flying Fortress losses sustained over German territory were directly attributable to devastating anti-aircraft fire, rather than the agile Messerschmitts or the robust Focke-Wulfs of the Luftwaffe. Indeed, air crews expressed a profound preference for confronting a dozen or more Luftwaffe fighters in a direct aerial combat scenario, rather than enduring the terrifying ordeal of navigating through a heavily concentrated flak barrage, such as those encountered over vital industrial complexes like Schweinfurt or the sprawling Ruhr Valley. The sheer lethality of flak, however, extended far beyond the mere volume of ordnance discharged into the sky. The German defense establishment had meticulously refined anti-aircraft defense into an exacting scientific discipline. Every major industrial objective within the Third Reich was meticulously encircled and fortified with extensive batteries of both 88 mm and 105 mm anti-aircraft cannons. Yet, the true devastating killing power emanated not solely from these powerful guns themselves, but from the sophisticated interconnected system that underpinned and orchestrated their operations. German flak crews did not simply elevate their formidable weapons towards the heavens and optimistically discharge their ammunition. Instead, they employed remarkably sophisticated predictive technologies, advanced mechanisms capable of precisely calculating the exact future position of an incoming bomber within an astonishing 30-second time frame. These intricate computations meticulously factored in every critical variable, including the target aircraft's current speed, its precise altitude, and its directional vector. Consequently, by the time the bomber formation arrived at the calculated aerial coordinates, the shells had already detonated, saturating that precise volumetric region of sky with lethal fragments. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The operational strategies adopted by American bomber units throughout 1942 and the nascent months of 1943 inadvertently rendered the task for German anti-aircraft gunners almost effortlessly efficient. The United States Army Air Forces had meticulously developed and institutionalized a tactical doctrine predicated upon high-altitude, daylight precision bombing, a methodology that inherently demanded long, unswerving, and absolutely level bomb runs. The highly advanced Norden bomb sight, a critical instrument for achieving pinpoint accuracy, necessitated an environment of unwavering stability. Any deviation, however minor, in the aircraft's flight parameters during the crucial final minutes preceding bomb release would catastrophically compromise targeting precision. Thus, B-17 formations would meticulously stabilize their flight approximately 10 to 15 miles from the designated target, acquire their initial aiming point, and then proceed in an arrow-straight trajectory at a constant altitude and unvarying airspeed until the lead bombardier initiated his bomb release sequence. Subsequently, every other aircraft within the formation would deploy its ordnance, following the trajectory of the lead aircraft's bombs. Those concluding 3 to 5 minutes before bomb release stretched into an agonizing eternity for the air crews. Initially, distant, diminutive black puffs would materialize ahead, the first harbingers of flak bursts, appearing almost harmless from a distance. Then, the formation would inexorably fly directly into this lethal expanse, and the aircraft would violently shudder and lurch from the concussions of near misses. Shrapnel, hurled at tremendous velocity, would rip through the thin aluminum skin of the bomber, creating sounds eerily reminiscent of hailstones furiously pelting a tin roof. However, these were no ordinary hailstones. These metallic shards possessed the devastating capability to sever a vital hydraulic line, fatally wound a waist gunner, or even ignite a volatile fuel tank. The acrid, pungent odor of cordite would insidiously seep into the flight deck, infiltrating through hundreds of minute perforations. And critically, there could be no deviation from the prescribed course. Crews were compelled to maintain rigorous formation integrity, precise altitude, and an unwavering heading, all while German predictive systems mathematically orchestrated their demise with chilling mechanical precision. This inherent predictability of the American bombing runs was proving catastrophically lethal to the bomber crews. Every bombardier, to achieve the requisite accuracy, demanded identical, optimal conditions, a perfectly stable aircraft platform, a clear and unobstructed sight picture of the target, and the complete absence of any evasive action. Correspondingly, every pilot adhered to an identical flight profile, rigorously dictated by the established training manuals. The German military was acutely aware of these operational rigidities. Their anti-aircraft officers had meticulously studied American tactical methodologies, precisely timed the duration of bomb runs, and accurately charted the typical approach patterns. They understood that once a B-17 formation committed to its bombing run, it would steadfastly maintain a consistent course, typically at an altitude of precisely 25,000 feet, allowing for minor variations of a few hundred feet, and at a constant airspeed of approximately 180 miles per hour. This foreknowledge allowed their sophisticated predictive fire control systems to be configured and primed well in advance of the bomber's arrival. By the spring of 1943, bomber crews found themselves engaged in grim personal calculations of their chances of survival. Engagements with enemy fighters, though undeniably terrifying in their ferocity, were typically fleeting encounters. A Focke-Wulf 190, for instance, would execute its attack pass and disengage within mere seconds. In stark contrast, Flak presented an impersonal yet utterly relentless adversary. It pursued the aircraft unceasingly throughout the entire target zone, forming a veritable curtain of steel that crews were compelled to breach to accomplish their mission. Some airmen recounted navigating through flak barrages of such extraordinary density that individual explosions appeared to merge into a continuous, undulating wall of dark smoke punctuated by vivid red-orange flashes, a terrifying spectacle that the formation had no choice but to stoically endure. Experienced veterans would counsel new recruits to suppress all thought, to simply secure themselves, orient the aircraft towards the objective, and pray that their fate was not sealed by one of the countless exploding shells. The prevailing tactical doctrine, demanding precision bombing through precision flying, appeared to be immutable. Yet men were tragically perishing in those predictable linear flight paths, prompting some pilots to contemplate whether alternative strategies might exist. The very device that rendered German flak so devastatingly lethal was housed within reinforced concrete bunkers strategically located near every anti-aircraft battery, the Kommandoggerät 40. This sophisticated mechanical computer possessed the extraordinary capability to forecast a bomber's future coordinates with almost supernatural accuracy. This was not merely speculative estimation or the product of seasoned gunners' visual assessments of the sky. Rather, it was applied mathematics rendered concrete, an intricate assembly of gears and cams that computed complex ballistic trajectories with a speed and precision far exceeding any human crew's capacity. This system embodied the zenith of contemporary fire control innovation, and American bomber crews were tragically perishing as a direct consequence of its unparalleled precision. The intricate operational sequence commenced with the strategic deployment of optical rangefinders encircling each individual flak battery. These advanced stereoscopic instruments, some boasting impressive base lengths approaching 5 meters, were meticulously engineered to ascertain the precise distance to an aerial target at altitudes reaching up to 40,000 feet. Highly skilled operators would meticulously track bomber formations through their sophisticated optical systems, continuously transmitting accurate range information to the Kommandoggerät via electrical impulses. Concurrently, other dedicated operators diligently measured the target's azimuth and elevation angles. Thus, 3 vital streams of data, encompassing range, angular bearing, and vertical altitude, were fed into the predictive computer at intervals of just a few seconds, providing a constant flow of essential targeting information. Within the intricate confines of the Kommandoggerät, a complex labyrinth of mechanical calculators sprang into action. This ingenious apparatus did not merely register the bomber's instantaneous position at that specific moment. Rather, its primary and most critical function was to compute the precise location the bomber would occupy by the time the anti-aircraft shell intercepted it. An 88mm projectile, when discharged from an altitude of 25,000 feet, required approximately 30 seconds to attain its target elevation. Over this crucial 30-second interval, a B-17 maintaining an airspeed of 180 miles per hour would traverse a significant distance of roughly 1.5 miles. The Kommandoggerät meticulously factored in this forward movement, alongside numerous other critical variables such as wind deviation, atmospheric density, ambient temperature, and the specific ballistic properties inherent to the ammunition being deployed. An elaborate interplay of cams and gears meticulously interlocked, executing complex calculus through sophisticated mechanical analog computation. The precisely calculated output from the predictive system was relayed instantaneously and directly to the gun layers. Indicator dials on each AE 8mm gun received uninterrupted updates detailing the precise elevation angle, the traverse bearing, and, most crucially, the critical fuse setting. German time fuses in 1943 were capable of being calibrated with extraordinary accuracy to within mere tenths of a second. The Kommandoggerät meticulously determined the exact instant each shell needed to detonate to optimally position its lethal fragmentation pattern within the bomber's projected future coordinates. Ammunition loaders would then meticulously adjust the fuse rings in strict accordance with the predictor's computed solution, whereupon the gun would discharge its projectile, provided the bomber steadfastly maintained its predetermined course and velocity. The underlying mathematical calculations proved flawlessly accurate, leading to devastating results. A proficiently trained German anti-aircraft battery possessed the formidable capability to launch 6 rounds per gun into the aerial battlespace every single minute. A standard heavy flak battery, typically comprised between 6 and 8 guns, all intricately synchronized and controlled by a single commando-jurate unit. This collective firepower translated into a formidable rate of 40 to 50 shells per minute, each meticulously detonating at a precisely computed location in the sky. The predictive system would incessantly refine and update its targeting solution as fresh tracking data streamed in, effectively walking the barrage along the bomber formation's anticipated flight trajectory. The devastating outcome was the creation of a volumetric section of airspace, saturated with lethal steel fragments, precisely timed to materialize at the identical coordinates simultaneously occupied by the bomber formation. This sophisticated system operated on one crucial foundational prerequisite. It demanded predictable behavior from its target. The commando-jurate's intricate calculations were predicated on the fundamental assumption that the target aircraft would steadfastly adhere to its prevailing velocity vector. Should a bomber abruptly alter its altitude or airspeed, the predictor's meticulously derived solution would instantly be rendered inaccurate and invalid. However, the German military possessed an intimate and comprehensive understanding of American operational doctrine. They had meticulously acquired captured training manuals, extensively interrogated prisoners of war, and diligently observed hundreds of bombing sorties. Consequently, they were acutely aware that once a B-17 formation initiated its bombing run, it would rigorously maintain consistent flight parameters for a critical period of 3 to 5 minutes. The commando-jurate was therefore specifically engineered to capitalize on this inherent and exploitable predictability. By the middle of 1943, the devastating efficacy of this system was demonstrably quantifiable through statistical analysis over formidable targets such as Bremen, Hamburg, and the industrial heartlands of the Ruhr. Anti-aircraft batteries were achieving unprecedented hit rates, levels of accuracy that would have been utterly unattainable through conventional manual gun-laying techniques. Post-mission damage reports consistently indicated that the vast majority of bombers returning to England bore evidence of flak damage, with shells consistently detonating at precisely the intended altitude. The distribution of fragmentation was far from haphazard or random. Rather, fragments were consistently impacting at the coordinates meticulously calculated by the predictive devices. These mechanical intellects were decisively prevailing in a grim mathematical contest, leaving American air crews without an effective countermeasure. They were, in essence, adhering to established doctrine and flying directly into a sophisticated computational snare, and any alteration to this fundamental doctrine appeared insurmountable. The indispensable Norden bomb sight necessitated unwavering stability, and this very stability was precisely the condition the commando-jurate required to inflict lethal damage. Clearly, a critical shift was imperative. Yet, in the summer of 1943, the precise nature of this essential change remained entirely unknown. The date of August 17, 1943, irrevocably marked the turning point that compelled a comprehensive re-evaluation of all existing strategies. The synchronized dual assault on Schweinfurt and Regensburg both pivotal hubs for ball bearing and aircraft manufacturing, constituted the most profound incursion into German airspace that the 8th Air Force had undertaken to that point. While mission strategists had certainly anticipated casualties, the scale of devastation inflicted over these objectives dramatically surpassed all prior projections. From the original complement of 376 B-17s that had launched from English airfields that fateful morning, a staggering 60 aircraft failed to return. An additional 168 bombers limped back, so extensively damaged that a significant number were permanently rendered unfit for future flight operations. The resulting casualty rate soared to an unsustainable 20%, a figure far exceeding the operational viability for any sustained military endeavor. The intensity of anti-aircraft fire encountered over Schweinfurt was utterly unprecedented in the experience of the air crews. Gunners recounted observing barrage concentrations of such extraordinary density that individual explosions coalesced into an unbroken, opaque black cloud. One pilot from the 381st Bomb Group vividly described the harrowing experience of navigating into a veritable wall of smoke, within which discrete flak bursts were indistinguishable, instead perceiving only a turbulent, churning maelstrom of shrapnel and concussive blast waves that tossed his aircraft about like a mere leaf caught in a tempest. The fire, meticulously guided by the predictive systems, achieved a devastating level of accuracy. Shells consistently detonated with lethal precision within the altitude band of 23,000 to 26,000 feet, which was the exact vertical stratum where the bomber formation was most densely concentrated, maximizing its destructive potential. The aerial bombardment stream of formidable force was meticulously concentrated. The casualties sustained were far from haphazardly distributed. Instead, aircraft, adhering strictly to the conventional bombing approach, maintaining a straight, level trajectory with unvarying altitude and airspeed, endured the most severe devastation. It was observed that the lead bombardiers within each formation, compelled to uphold the most unwavering flight path for the longest duration, suffered an excessively high proportion of losses. German anti-aircraft defenses had shrewdly learned to focus their formidable firepower on these formation leaders, recognizing that incapacitating the lead aircraft would inevitably disrupt and scatter the entire group's bombing pattern. This strategic targeting underscored that the Commando Jarrett predictors were not merely operating with mechanical precision, but were being guided by astute, tactical intelligence. Back at the nerve center of Bomber Command Headquarters in High Wycombe, the grim statistics descended with the force of an actual explosion. General Frederick Anderson and his dedicated staff had always acknowledged that executing daylight precision bombing missions would inherently be a costly endeavor. However, the alarming figures now confronting them suggested that the entire operational strategy might be fundamentally untenable. Simple arithmetic painted a stark picture. If every deep penetration mission resulted in a debilitating 20% loss rate, a crew's prospects of surviving a complete 25-mission tour plummeted to virtually zero. The crucial replacement pipeline proved utterly incapable of keeping pace with such a rapid depletion of personnel. Training facilities across the United States were already operating at their absolute maximum capacity, yet they simply could not produce new crews swiftly enough to offset this catastrophic rate of attrition. The grim reality of the crisis was unequivocally underscored by the second Schweinfurt raid, executed on October 14, 1943. This harrowing day, forever etched into memory as Black Thursday, witnessed the loss of another 60 bombers, with an additional 17 aircraft so extensively damaged they were deemed beyond repair and subsequently written off. The 8th Air Force had dispatched a formidable force of 291 B-17s against the vital target. But by nightfall, a staggering 77 of those mighty flying fortresses were gone, representing a devastating 26% loss rate. While the critical ball-bearing plants were indeed struck, the price exacted for this success was nothing short of ruinous. We hope you are finding this historical account compelling. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video for the full story. We would be truly grateful for your like and subscription. Also, we invite you to share in the comments where you are from and what your thoughts are on this crucial aspect of wartime aviation strategy. Following the devastating impact of Black Thursday, all deep penetration missions were reluctantly and temporarily suspended. The ambitious bomber offensive, which had been meticulously planned to precede and pave the way for the D-Day landings, found itself halted cold by the formidable and increasingly effective German defenses. Consequently, intelligence officers immediately commenced meticulous debriefings, diligently scrutinizing every detail in an urgent quest to identify any discernible pattern that might elucidate why some aircraft miraculously survived while others tragically perished. Their investigations included a thorough examination of flak damage on returning bombers, meticulously noting the precise locations where anti-aircraft shells had detonated relative to the aircraft's position. Furthermore, they conducted extensive interviews with pilots and bombardiers, pressing them for exact recollections of the moments when they observed the most intense concentrations of enemy fire. Gradually, a distinct pattern began to unfold, though it initially struck many as profoundly counterintuitive. Several air crews reported a perplexing observation. Flak bursts appeared to be forecasting their position, exploding discernibly ahead of where their aircraft were currently flying, as if the German gunners possessed an uncanny foreknowledge of their future location. This, it turned out, was precisely what was occurring. The Commando Jurat system, an advanced German anti-aircraft predictor, was, by design, engineered to place shells in the bomber's anticipated future position, rather than its immediate current one. This startling observation, however, ignited a crucial and transformative question within the minds of operational planners. What if the bomber simply wasn't in that predicted future position? What if the very assumptions underpinning the predictor's calculations were somehow violated? Established doctrine unequivocally dictated that no deviation was permissible during the critical bomb run. The extensive training manuals were explicit and unambiguous on this point. The entire theoretical framework of precision daylight bombing was predicated upon an absolute and unwavering stability. Yet, courageous airmen were sacrificing their lives for the sake of that stability, prompting some far-sighted officers to begin questioning the true value of bombing accuracy if the crews did not survive to even witness their target. The profound crisis that gripped the 8th Air Force in August and October of 1943 had effectively pried open a significant crack in the conventional understanding, and it was through this nascent fissure that ground-breaking innovation would ultimately emerge. The initial departures from this rigid doctrine did not originate in the hallowed halls of headquarters, but rather in the cramped cockpits high above Germany. Veteran pilots, those with 15 or 20 perilous missions successfully completed, began to place their trust in their honed instincts above the strictures of their training manuals. Captain Robert Morgan of the 91st Bomb Group, who would later achieve widespread renown for guiding Memphis Belle through her entire combat tour, started to cautiously experiment with slight, subtle altitude variations during his final approach to targets in late 1943. He was not outright defying explicit orders, rather he was interpreting them with a degree of pragmatic flexibility. Crucially, his bombardier found that he could still obtain acceptable sight pictures for accurate targeting, even if the aircraft ascended or descended by a few hundred feet during the bombing run. Other aircrews similarly began to notice something quite unusual when they undertook these unconventional, though initially unauthorized, adjustments. Lieutenant James McLaughlin, at the controls of a B-17 affectionately named Lucky Strike, recounted a particularly striking incident over Bremen in November 1943, an event that would be debated and analyzed in crew quarters for many weeks thereafter. His formation had stabilized onto its bomb run at a standard altitude of 24,000 feet when intense anti-aircraft fire began to envelop their position. McLaughlin instinctively pulled back on the yoke, causing his aircraft to gain approximately 400 feet in altitude over the subsequent minute. To his astonishment, the flak bursts that had moments earlier been perilously close suddenly appeared to detonate significantly below his aircraft. He had climbed into what should have been an area of even heavier concentration, yet the shells were exploding precisely where he had been, not where he now was. The profound explanation for this phenomenon took a considerable period to fully grasp, because it seemed to contradict all conventional wisdom. Every pilot's deeply ingrained instinct dictated that one should always dive away from flak, seeking to get below it and utilize gravity to accelerate rapidly out of the danger zone. Yet, McLaughlin had ascended, and the flak had miraculously missed. Word of this extraordinary occurrence spread swiftly throughout the 91st and neighboring bomb groups. Some pilots skeptically dismissed it as mere lucky timing, postulating that perhaps the German gunners had simply adjusted their aim at that precise moment. However, others, spurred by McLaughlin's experience, began to experiment themselves, attempting small, controlled altitude changes during their bomb runs and meticulously noting where the flak bursts appeared relative to their newly adopted positions. Captain Charles Cruikshank of the 303rd Bomb Group undertook what amounted to systematic field testing during missions throughout December 1943. Before each mission, he would meticulously brief his crew that he might deviate from the standard altitude during the bomb run, and he specifically requested that his bombardier report whether such a deviation impacted bombing accuracy. On 3 consecutive missions targeting objectives in northwestern Germany, Cruikshank initiated gentle, steady climbs of between 500 and 800 feet, commencing approximately 2 minutes before the bombs were released. His bombardier confirmed that the sophisticated Norden bomb sight could indeed compensate effectively for the climb rate, provided it remained consistent. More importantly, the flak that had been predicted for their original lower altitude consistently burst harmlessly below them. The underlying physics of this phenomenon became remarkably clear once pilots began to thoroughly analyze the situation. Those formidable 88 mm anti-aircraft shells required approximately 30 seconds to reach their designated altitude. Therefore, if a commando Juret predictor calculated that an aircraft would be at 24,000 feet in 30 seconds, but the aircraft was actually climbing at a steady rate of 100 feet per minute, it would, in fact, be at 24,500 feet, when the shells arrived at their preset altitude. This critical time of flight thus created an exploitable gap, a window of opportunity that strategic altitude changes could leverage. The commando juret was undeniably extraordinarily accurate, but its calculations were based solely on the bomber's current, consistent behavior. Alter that behavior, and its precise firing solution became instantly obsolete. Initially, this revolutionary concept was met with widespread skepticism. Operations officers voiced serious apprehensions regarding the integrity of defensive formations. They argued that, if individual pilots began climbing and descending at will, the meticulously tight defensive boxes, crucial for mutual protection, would inevitably disintegrate. Group commanders expressed considerable worry that bombing accuracy would diminish significantly if bombardiers were forced to operate with unstable platforms. Some senior staff officers even considered the entire idea to be verging on insubordination, pilots indulging in creative maneuvers when they were expected to adhere strictly to established procedures. The existing doctrine, they emphasized, had been meticulously developed by seasoned experts, rigorously tested at bombardier schools, and painstakingly validated in the crucible of combat. One simply did not abandon such a well-established doctrine merely because a few pilots had novel theories. However, those audacious pilots who embraced the new approach consistently returned safely, while many others did not. By January 1944, a sufficient volume of mission reports explicitly mentioned altitude variations and the observed flak patterns, accumulating to a point where intelligence officers could no longer disregard the compelling correlation. Crews that maintained rigid, unwavering altitude discipline appeared to sustain more hits than those who strategically introduced variations. While this evidence was not yet conclusive scientific proof, it was undeniably indicative. The gathered data remained largely anecdotal, scattered across dozens of mission debriefings and numerous crew accounts. Nevertheless, an undeniable pattern was definitively emerging. The rigid, straight, and level approach that doctrine had so steadfastly demanded might ironically be precisely what the German predictors required to effectively target and destroy them. Innovation, born from the raw instinct for survival, was beginning to fundamentally challenge the textbook, and the mounting, albeit anecdotal, evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The life-saving tactic that would ultimately preserve thousands of lives acquired its evocative name from the very action it seemed to defy: climbing into the flak. By early 1944, a sufficient number of crews had experimented with these altitude changes, allowing the underlying mechanics of the technique to solidify and become clearly understood. This was not about random evasive maneuvers or panicked, uncontrolled climbing. Rather, it represented a meticulously calculated exploitation of the critical time gap between when German predictors formulated their firing calculations and when those precise calculations culminated in exploding shells at altitude. The optimal technique involved initiating a steady, controlled climb of between 500 and 1,000 feet during the final approach to the target, commencing approximately 3 minutes before the designated bomb's away point. The precise timing of this maneuver proved absolutely paramount. Initiating the climb too early would simply allow the German tracking stations to feed the new flight data into their commando juret, which would then efficiently recalculate for the bomber's altered trajectory. Conversely, commencing the climb too late would deny the bombardier sufficient time to establish a stable sight picture before the critical release of bombs. The optimal window, the sweet spot, appeared to be consistently around the 2.5 to 3 minute mark. At this precise juncture, German predictors had already finalized their firing solutions and had begun transmitting the fuse settings directly to the anti-aircraft guns. Loaders on the ground were already setting the time rings on shells based on calculations that erroneously assumed the bomber would still be maintaining its original rigid altitude. Those lethal shells were in many cases already being rammed into the breeches of the waiting guns. The intense aerial combat of World War II saw crews consistently pushing the boundaries of survival, particularly when confronted with enemy anti-aircraft fire. A critical aspect of evading these devastating barrages was not only the precise timing of evasive maneuvers, but also the manner in which altitude changes were executed. Pulling back on the controls too aggressively, for instance, could destabilize the aircraft formation, making it difficult for the bombardier to maintain an accurate sight picture and ensure bombing precision. Conversely, a climb that was too gentle would fail to elevate the aircraft sufficiently to escape the predetermined burst zones of enemy shells. Through extensive combat experience, seasoned pilots discovered that a consistent ascent rate, typically ranging from 80 to 120 feet per minute, yielded the most favorable outcomes. At an average rate of 100 feet per minute, a bomber could gain approximately 300 feet of altitude within the 3 minutes leading up to the bomb release. This elevation was just enough to position the aircraft safely above the predicted detonation altitude of enemy shells, which were aimed using sophisticated targeting systems, yet subtle enough to allow bombardiers to maintain their instruments and fine-tune their calculations without disruption. A poignant illustration of this tactic's efficacy comes from the diary entries of Lieutenant William Cassiday, a pilot with the 384th Bomb Group. He recounted his crew's initial deliberate ascent into a flak-ridden sky over Frankfurt in February 1944. As their B-17 steadied for its bomb run at 23,500 feet, the ominous black puffs of flak began to appear directly ahead. Defying conventional doctrine, which typically advocated for maintaining a stable altitude during bomb runs, Cassiday initiated a gradual climb. His co-pilot, understandably concerned, questioned the decision to ascend directly into the menacing clouds of explosions. However, Cassiday steadfastly maintained his climb rate at approximately 90 feet per minute. Soon, the exploding flak, which had initially been bursting at their original altitude, began to appear noticeably below them. They successfully released their bombs from an elevated position of 24,200 feet, and remarkably, the entire formation returned to base without sustaining any losses over the target area. This successful maneuver underscored the effectiveness of the tactic, which exploited a fundamental vulnerability within the German fire control system. The sophisticated commando Gerät, while capable of generating highly accurate firing solutions, was not designed for instantaneous recalculation. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Once the tracking data was fed into the predictor and a firing solution was generated, there was an inherent delay of 20 to 30 seconds before updated data could be fully processed into a fresh solution. In the interim, shells with preset fuses were already loaded and fired, committed to detonating at a specific altitude derived from outdated information. If the target aircraft had altered its altitude During this critical processing and firing cycle, these shells would invariably detonate harmlessly in empty air. The time of flight delay further compounded this protective effect. For instance, an 82mm shell fired from the ground at a target flying at 25,000 feet would typically take about 28 to 32 seconds to reach its destination, contingent on prevailing atmospheric conditions. During this approximately 30-second flight time, a B-17 climbing at 100 feet per minute would gain an additional 500 feet of altitude. Consequently, the shell would arrive at the altitude where the predictor had calculated the bomber would be, but the aircraft itself would actually be 500 feet higher. The resulting fragmentation pattern from the burst would disperse in a conical shape below the aircraft, with the majority of lethal fragments traveling horizontally or downwards from the explosion point. By climbing, crews effectively positioned themselves above this deadly kill zone. Crews began to articulate their observations of this flak phenomenon in vivid, visual terms that perfectly captured the concept. They would describe watching shells bursting at what appeared to be their current altitude, only to realize these explosions were occurring where they had just been moments before. One navigator famously likened it to observing footsteps chasing them up a staircase, with each explosion marking their previous position, yet they were always one crucial step ahead. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. Instead of feeling like helpless targets flying through an inevitable barrage, pilots gained a powerful sense of actively defeating the German fire control system. They were, in essence, turning the predictor's very precision against itself. The Kommandogerät continued to calculate perfectly, but its calculations were based on an aircraft that, at those specific coordinates, no longer existed. By March 1944, this innovative altitude change tactic had transitioned from individual experimentation to a formalized doctrine at the group level. Colonel Curtis LeMay, who commanded the 3rd Bomb Division, was among the first senior officers to officially sanction the technique. Having meticulously reviewed mission reports and loss statistics, LeMay had cultivated a formidable reputation for his tactical innovations. He was the architect of the combat box formation, a strategic arrangement that provided B-17s with overlapping defensive fire, and he possessed a keen eye for effective field innovations. His operations order, issued on March 12, 1944, granted group leaders the discretion to employ altitude variations during bomb runs, providing specific guidelines regarding optimal timing and climb rates. The implementation of this new strategy, however, was not universally accepted without resistance. Adherents of strict operational protocols argued that any deviation from stable flight would inevitably compromise the very precision that justified daylight bombing in the first place. If American bombers were to accept the heavy losses associated with daylight operations, rather than adopting the Royal Air Force's night bombing approach, those sacrifices had to be demonstrably offset by superior bombing accuracy. Major Harold Bowman, stationed at White Bomber Command Headquarters, submitted a memo in early April, expressing concerns that altitude changes might degrade the circular error probable, the statistical radius within which bombs were expected to fall, to unacceptable levels. The memo formally requested a temporary moratorium on the tactic until comprehensive testing could be conducted at bombardier training facilities located in the United States. However, the combat crews themselves had already decisively settled this debate through their practical, tangible results. Bombardiers consistently reported that as long as the climb rate remained steady and did not exceed 120 feet per minute, the Norden bomb site's gyroscopic stabilization and rate mechanisms were fully capable of compensating for the ascent. The bombardier simply needed to adjust his rate knobs to account for the climb, treating it as another variable, much like wind drift or airspeed. Lieutenant Thomas Farabee, who would later achieve immense renown as the bombardier on the Enola Gay, flew numerous missions with the 384th Bomb Group, utilizing these climb techniques, and consistently managed to place his bomb patterns within acceptable parameters of the target's mean point of impact. Training protocols were swiftly adapted to integrate these new findings. New crews arriving in England during the spring of 1944 received comprehensive briefings that included the altitude change technique as a standard component of their target approach procedures. The guidance provided was highly specific. Crews were instructed to initiate a steady climb 150 seconds before the anticipated bombs away, maintain a climb rate between 80 and 110 feet per minute, and critically hold that rate constant to provide the bombardier with a predictable and stable platform. Lead bombardiers, who bore the crucial responsibility of controlling the bomb release for entire formations, were granted additional latitude to adjust the initiation timing based on their real-time observations of flak patterns and German tracking behavior. The dissemination of this vital tactic across the 8th Air Force occurred organically, spreading through the bomber stream itself. Crews would observe neighboring groups successfully employing climb techniques and would note their significantly reduced flak damage during subsequent mission debriefings. Back at their respective bases, pilots would eagerly compare notes about what strategies proved most effective and which did not. The 91st Bomb Group's experience over Brunswick on April 8, 1944, became a widely discussed and compelling example. This group initiated a climb from 24,000 to 25,200 feet during their bomb run, while adjacent groups maintained their original altitude. The climbing group sustained flak damage to only 4 aircraft, none of which were serious. In stark contrast, the groups that held their altitude lost 3 bombers and had an additional 11 aircraft severely damaged. News of such stark disparities in outcomes spread far more rapidly and effectively than any official memo could possibly travel. Some groups developed intricate variations on the fundamental technique. The 305th Bomb Group, for instance, experimented with a climbing turn, which combined altitude gain with a subtle course adjustment during the final minute, before bombs away. This maneuver introduced both a lateral and vertical displacement, further confounding predictor calculations. Other groups attempted step climbs, where they would hold altitude for 30 seconds, then rapidly climb 200 feet, and then hold altitude again. However, the emerging consensus strongly favored the steady, continuous climb as the most effective method. The step climbs, it was found, inadvertently provided German tracking crews with identifiable patterns that could be fed into their predictors, whereas the steady climb presented continuously changing data that was far more challenging to process into accurate firing solutions. By May 1944, as preparations for the impending Normandy invasion intensified, the altitude change technique had firmly become standard operating procedure across the majority of the 8th Air Force's bomb groups. Mission planning documents now explicitly included climb initiation points and target climb altitudes. In the same way, they specified initial points and bomb release lines. New pilots arriving fresh from the United States learned this technique during their very first orientation flights, even before embarking on their inaugural combat mission. What had initially begun as an unauthorized deviation from established doctrine had, through demonstrated effectiveness and necessity, evolved into doctrine itself. The bomber force had undergone a significant tactical evolution, adapting to survive against a fire control system that had, just months prior, been decimating formations with alarming regularity. This transformative change was not the result of high-level strategic planning, but rather the accumulated experience and ingenuity of the crews themselves, who discovered a practical way to defeat the very mathematical precision that sought to destroy them. The Germans, naturally, were not oblivious to these evolving tactics in the skies above their homeland. By the summer of 1944, Flak battery commanders were reporting to their superiors that American bomber formations were no longer maintaining predictable flight parameters during their bomb runs. Luftwaffe intelligence officers, through interrogating captured B-17 crews, quickly learned about the altitude change tactics that had become a standard procedure. The critical question that then arose was whether German fire control systems could adapt swiftly enough to effectively counter this significant evolution in American aerial strategy. I am from GA, your location, and I believe that the video topic highlights the incredible adaptability and ingenuity of combat personnel under extreme pressure. It's a fascinating example of how practical, on-the-ground innovation can quickly become formalized doctrine, saving lives and influencing the course of conflict. It also underscores the constant cat-and-mouse game of warfare, where technological advancements are met with tactical counters. The Commando Jurat predictor crews, facing an unforeseen challenge in American aerial strategy, implemented various defensive measures. Their initial and seemingly most logical response was to accelerate the frequency of tracking updates. Instead of transmitting positional data to the predictor every 8 to 10 seconds, operators attempted to provide new information every 4 to 5 seconds. The theoretical underpinning was straightforward. More frequent data input would enable the mechanical computing device to register changes in altitude more swiftly, and consequently, recalibrate firing solutions before artillery shells were launched. However, in practical application, human operators found it impossible to sustain such a rapid pace reliably. The demanding task of optically tracking a bomber at an altitude of 25,000 feet through rangefinders, while simultaneously articulating precise measurements every few seconds, inevitably led to profound fatigue and an increase in operational errors. The quality of the data invariably diminished when operators were compelled to rush their observations and inputs. German engineers also delved into potential modifications for the Commando Jurat system itself. Certain anti-aircraft batteries were equipped with upgraded predictors featuring supplementary calculating mechanisms specifically engineered to detect the rate of climb and integrate this crucial factor into their firing solutions. These enhanced units, officially designated Commando Jurat 40,41, began to be deployed at vital defensive strongholds around metropolitan Berlin and throughout the industrial Ruhr Valley during the middle of 1944. While these technological advancements offered a marginal improvement in accuracy, they ultimately proved incapable of surmounting the inherent problem of temporal lag. Even with superior computational capabilities, shells still required a substantial 30 seconds to reach their intended altitude, during which period bombers consistently ascended by approximately 500 feet. Although the predictor could estimate the ascent rate, any subsequent alteration or cessation of the climb by the bomber rendered this estimate inaccurate and ineffective. Another attempted resolution involved meticulously adjusting fuse settings to generate a more expansive vertical burst pattern. Traditional operational procedure dictated setting fuses for precise altitude detonation, which produced a concentrated horizontal fragmentation spread. German fuse technicians, however, embarked on a series of experiments with staggered settings. Some shells were fused to detonate at the precisely predicted altitude, while others were configured to explode 200 feet higher, and a third group was set for 400 feet higher. This innovative approach aimed to create a vertical ladder of explosions, specifically designed to bracket and encompass a climbing bomber. The formidable 8E emitter batteries defending the critical Merseburg refineries utilized this technique extensively during missions in September 1944. While this method undeniably increased the sheer volume of steel fragments saturating the air, it simultaneously reduced the density of fragmentation at any singular altitude, paradoxically diminishing the probability of a direct hit against individual aircraft. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The most efficacious German counter-tactic was not rooted in technological advancement, but rather in a significant procedural adjustment, initiating earlier engagement. Flak batteries began to commence firing at considerably greater ranges, engaging bomber formations between 8 and 10 miles from their intended target, rather than adhering to the previous practice of waiting until they were within 5 miles. This strategic shift compelled American pilots to initiate their evasive climbs earlier in their approach, thereby affording German tracking crews an extended window of opportunity to observe the altitude change and feed updated data into their predictors. Certain batteries experienced improved accuracy with this revised methodology, particularly in the vicinity of heavily fortified targets, such as the synthetic oil plants at Lona. Nevertheless, engaging at longer ranges meant that artillery shells traversed a greater expanse of atmosphere, which inevitably reduced their inherent accuracy and overall effectiveness. Even when fuse settings were meticulously calibrated, German tactical doctrine also underwent a pronounced shift, moving towards barrage fire over designated zones rather than the precision tracking of individual aircraft. This represented a profound philosophical departure from the sophisticated fire control system that had initially rendered the Kommandogerät such a lethal weapon. Instead of meticulously calculating precise interception points, batteries were instructed to saturate entire volumes of airspace with a deluge of shells, deployed at varied altitudes and with diverse fuse settings. This technique was colloquially dubbed flak carpets by the bomber crews, dense, interwoven fields of explosive bursts that a formation was compelled to traverse, irrespective of any altitude adjustments. This approach, however, necessitated the expenditure of enormous quantities of ammunition and required larger concentrations of anti-aircraft guns, resources that Germany's rapidly deteriorating industrial capacity made increasingly arduous to supply. By the autumn of 1944, the effectiveness of German flak had demonstrably declined, notwithstanding the deployment of heavier gun concentrations to defend critical targets. Statistical analyses conducted by 8th Air Force Intelligence revealed that bomber loss rates attributable to Flak had plummeted from the catastrophic levels observed in late 1943 to more manageable and sustainable figures. Missions that would have resulted in the loss of 20 aircraft in 1943 were now incurring losses of only 8 or 10. The altitude change tactics were not the singular determinant in this reduction. Increased fighter escort, improved formation discipline, and a degradation in German crew training all contributed to this overall trend. However, the tactical adaptation had undeniably mitigated the effectiveness of the predictor system. The commandojet nonetheless remained a formidable weapon until the cessation of hostilities, particularly when American formations committed errors or when mechanical failures forced bombers to adhere to predictable flight paths. Yet, it never again achieved the mathematical certainty it had possessed in 1943. The technological advantage had been effectively countered, not by superior American technology, but by astute tactical adaptation. The bombers had not overcome the predictor system through engineering prowess. Rather, they had defeated it by deliberately refusing to conform to the behavioral assumptions made by the system's designers. The efficacy of climbing into the Flak became quantifiably evident once a sufficient volume of mission data had been amassed for rigorous analysis. Post-war investigations undertaken by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey meticulously examined loss rates both prior to and following the widespread adoption of altitude change tactics. The compiled data presented an unequivocal narrative. Bombing missions executed during the first half of 1944, incorporating climb techniques, demonstrated a reduction in Flak-related casualties, ranging from approximately 15 to 30% when compared to analogous missions over similar targets in late 1943. The precise variance was contingent upon the specific target defenses and the proficiency with which formations executed the climbs. But the statistical trend was indisputable. Individual group records furnished more granular and compelling evidence. The 100th Bomb Group, which had tragically earned the somber moniker Bloody Hundredth due to its devastating losses in 1943, witnessed a dramatic amelioration in its casualty rates subsequent to the implementation of formal climb procedures in March 1944. Between March and August 1944, the group undertook 87 combat missions with a loss rate of 3. 2% per mission. While still perilous, this figure represented a substantial improvement over the unsustainable rates of the preceding year. Their operations officer, Captain Robert Rosenthal, largely attributed this improvement to the combination of altitude tactics and enhanced fighter escort. Surviving crew members from this group consistently cited the climb technique as a critical factor that afforded them a viable chance against predictor-directed anti-aircraft fire. This innovative technique exerted an influence that extended beyond mere immediate survival rates. It fundamentally reshaped how bomber crews perceived their own vulnerability. In 1943, Flak had been an impersonal and inescapable force that crews simply endured, akin to adverse weather conditions. By mid-1944, however, crews had gained a profound understanding that they could actively counteract it through disciplined and proper flying techniques. This psychological transformation held immense significance for morale. Pilots felt less like helpless targets and more like active participants in a tactical duel. Training programs began to emphasize this newfound empowerment. New crews were instructed that they were not merely piloting bombers. They were operating within a complex electronic and mechanical warfare environment where their strategic decisions could effectively neutralize enemy systems. The enduring legacy of climbing into the Flak permeated well beyond the confines of World War II. Air Force tactical development officers meticulously studied the technique's success when formulating doctrine for bomber operations in future conflicts. The fundamental principle that introducing an element of unpredictability into flight parameters could effectively defeat prediction-based fire control became a cornerstone of evasive tactics. During the Korean War, B-29 crews, confronting Soviet-designed, radar-directed flak, employed variations of the altitude change technique. The underlying physics remained consistent, even though the predictors had evolved from rudimentary mechanical calculators to nascent electronic systems. The advent of the jet age did not diminish the relevance of this crucial lesson. Strategic Air Command's B-52 crews underwent rigorous training on terrain-following penetration profiles during the Cold War, continuously varying their altitude to complicate Soviet surface-to-air missile calculations. While these missiles were considerably faster than 80-meter shells, and their guidance systems were electronic rather than mechanical, the core principle persisted. Constant altitude was inherently predictable, and predictability was lethal. Modern terrain-following radar and sophisticated automated flight control systems executed the very same basic concept that B-17 pilots had empirically discovered over Germany. Maintain unpredictability within the operational constraints of your mission requirements. Even in the contemporary era of stealth technology and standoff weaponry, the tactical DNA of climbing into the flak endures. Modern strike planning places significant emphasis on varying ingress profiles, meticulously avoiding predictable flight paths, and incorporating dynamic jinking maneuvers during terminal attack phases. While the specific methodologies have evolved in tandem with technological advancements, the underlying logical framework remains unaltered. Enemy fire control systems, whether they are antiquated mechanical predictors or advanced phased array radars, necessitate predictable target behavior to achieve optimal accuracy. Deny them that predictability, and their effectiveness will inevitably degrade. The compelling narrative of B-17 pilots deliberately climbing into the flak represents something far grander than a specific tactical innovation. It vividly illustrates how military organizations adapt and evolve when established doctrine confronts the stark realities of combat, and when reality ultimately prevails. The Army Air Forces had invested monumental resources into developing and refining a doctrine of precision daylight bombing. That doctrine had been rigorously tested, meticulously refined, and formally codified in training manuals. It represented the official, sanctioned method for conducting aerial operations. However, when that approved methodology began to claim crews at unsustainable rates, the organization demonstrated remarkable flexibility and proved capable of evolving its tactics to survive and succeed. The capacity for any organization to remain sufficiently adaptable and responsive to evolving circumstances often proves critical for its sustained efficacy, and indeed its very survival. During a period of intense conflict, groundbreaking innovations frequently originated from the operational front lines, specifically from the courageous pilots and their dedicated crews, who, facing imminent peril and the stark realities of combat, placed greater trust in their immediate, on-the-ground observations and lived experiences than in the often rigid dictates of their established training manuals. This crucial process of adaptation succeeded precisely because leaders at various echelons within the command structure possessed the foresight to discern and validate legitimate field-level innovation, subsequently permitting its widespread adoption. General Curtis LeMay, alongside other discerning commanders of that era, possessed the absolute authority to mandate strict adherence to prevailing doctrine, potentially subjecting pilots who dared to diverge from approved operational procedures to severe disciplinary actions, including court-martial. Yet demonstrating remarkable wisdom and strategic acumen, they chose a different path. Instead, these leaders meticulously examined the empirical evidence presented by the crew's actions, recognized the undeniable effectiveness of these novel approaches, and then systematically formalized what was demonstrably working. This profound organizational flexibility, characterized by a genuine willingness to learn directly from the individuals actively engaged in the life-or-death struggle, perhaps constituted a factor as vitally important to the ultimate success and preservation of lives as the ingenious tactic itself. Ultimately, the air crews discovered an ingenious method to safeguard their lives, and the overarching command structure exhibited the intelligence and humility to empower them in doing so. Indeed, thousands of brave airmen were able to return home from the harrowing battlefields of World War II, a profound testament to the ingenuity of those who had the audacity to realize that ascending directly towards the trajectory of exploding anti-aircraft shells offered a far more judicious and survivable course of action than maintaining a steady, predictable flight path within the meticulously calculated yet undeniably lethal kill zone predicted by enemy fire control systems. This seemingly counterintuitive maneuver, which directly defied conventional wisdom and military dogma, presented a stark empirical challenge to established operational norms. Mathematically, according to the prevailing ballistic models and complex statistical probabilities of the time, such a maneuver appeared not merely improbable, but virtually impossible to consistently yield positive, life-saving results. Furthermore, the official operational doctrine of the Air Forces unequivocally declared it to be an incorrect, unauthorized, and fundamentally unsound deviation from standard procedure. Nevertheless, the irrefutable testimony of the actual survivors, those very individuals who had directly implemented the tactic and miraculously lived to tell the tale, powerfully affirmed its undeniable efficacy and life-saving potential. This profound historical episode, therefore, underscores a vital and enduring legacy for all high-stakes environments. Occasionally, the established manual or the meticulously prescribed procedures may prove inadequate, outdated, or even fundamentally flawed, and in such critical life-or-death moments, the imperative for survival unequivocally demands bold, unconventional innovation, irrespective of what the sanctioned guidelines or entrenched beliefs might dictate. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please also leave a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic,